Welcome to the Lean AI podcast, where we're flipping the AI conversation on its head by focusing on holistic strategies and tactics that drive AI adoption, rather than focusing solely on overcoming the technical challenges of AI. In every Season 1 episode of the Lean AI podcast, we talk with corporate AI leaders just like you, who've uncovered secrets of driving successful AI adoption with far less wasted time and investment. Our guests challenge established views and offer disruptive perspectives, providing new actionable insights. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Lean AI podcast. Today, we're excited to welcome Chris Withers, a seasoned leader known for his transformative roles in data and AI at BT Group and EY. Chris has pioneered the use of generative AI tools to enhance productivity and spearheaded major AI initiatives, significantly impacting business operations. He also advises AI startups, guiding them to leverage Gen AI for transformative results. His leadership in transforming business with generative AI is reshaping how companies leverage cutting-edge technology to drive growth and innovation. Chris, welcome. We're thrilled to have you on the show.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to chatting.
Could you maybe, for our listeners, give them a flavor for the types of AI deployments that you've been involved in? Have they been mainly applying AI to internal workflows at companies or helping companies to develop AI-powered products for external customers, or a mixture of both?
So I've been working in AI for about a decade now, and actually prior to EY, I was working and helped found sort of IBM Watson. So that was way back in 2014. And again, I think all through my career, there's been a mixture of internal and external. So IBM and IBM Watson started out with virtual agents, so helping to do customer service queries for banks, as well as taking facts from documents to help mortgage processing. So using AI to do automation. EY, we built pricing assistants to help commercial bankers. And then Gen AI came along, and the last couple of years at BT, some code generation tools, again, more customer service. So a real mixture of external and internal uses of the technology. Really anywhere there's good opportunity to use software to automate some of the things that we do today.
That's great. And I guess we're going to talk about maybe a differentiated approach that you've taken to AI development. Before we talk about that, could you maybe talk to us about the traditional approach to product development and maybe why that doesn't work in the space of AI?
Yeah, no, I'll actually go way back to sort of the IBM Watson days. So this was in the early days of virtual agents and natural language processing. And so our approach there was to, identify a use case. So this would be, say, a virtual agent to answer questions for students who were about to join a university. So we used to collect something called the ground truth. So that would be loads of questions and different varieties of the way people could ask that question. And then the technology at that time can generate the answers. So the answers were fairly formulaic. But what this resulted in was like a huge, long, often 6 months plus long process of collecting this ground truth, because most companies didn't have that data available. And only then would we launch. But you'd find actually that people asked questions in very different ways when they were starting to use this sort of technology, not in the same way that they would express themselves over the phone or in person. So loads of that effort of trying to collect all this information was wasted, because actually when it hit real people, they started to use it in very different ways. So one of the most formative experiences I had about doing this differently was working with a UK bank, NatWest, and we built the solution pretty quickly. And then the client there, Chris Popple, said, right, let's just put this out in the wild. And we were initially aghast, we got to do some testing first, Chris. And he said, no, come on, let's get it wild. Let's get it out there to customers. Let's see how they would use it. And so what we ended up doing was, instead of just mass launching it to the millions and millions of customers that NatWest had at that time, we just throttled it to 50 questions in one day. And at the end of those 50 questions, we turned it off. We looked at the interactions the virtual agent had, and I think we identified 34 bugs. They weren't all technical bugs. Sometimes customers didn't understand the answers. Sometimes it misinterpreted the way the questions had been written. But overnight, we sort of fixed, I think, 20 plus of those bugs. And the next day, we did another 50 questions. And the next day, another 50 questions. And so that really fast-paced, sort of iterative way of seeing how people were actually using it and adapting it to that just meant that we saved so much time, and the team was much smaller and much quicker. And it was one of the first virtual agents to go live across the whole country in the UK. And it really sort of opened my eyes to that approach of, you can have all of these sort of ideas prior to how you think people will use technology. But when you've got this brand new technology, there's just no substitute really for getting it out in front of them and learning from that rather than sort of making lots of assumptions up front.
And so I guess jumping into your differentiated approach, then let's just talk about some of the components. The work that you're asking your people to do, I'm assuming is different using your approach versus the traditional approach of make a big plan and then go execute the whole plan. What does it feel like from a team's perspective? What's their work look like on a daily basis?
It's really, I think, empowering for the team. But I think the approach we now take, and I take whenever I'm deploying and working on one of these projects, is really to try and move away from this idea of massive teams with fixed project management timelines. And I think there's always a mistake, particularly in big companies, that you assume you can know a lot of the answers up front. And therefore, you build out a plan accordingly. So now I think it's much more important. You've always got to have a vision for how, and if we're talking about AI technology now and Gen AI, you have a vision for how you think that technology could be used and the business benefit that it's going to deliver. So we capture that in a charter, which captures really just on one page what we're trying to achieve, what the benefits would be, how will the customer, whoever's using it, internal, external, benefit from it afterwards. But then rather than at that point, we then take a step back and really work in a cross-functional team way in a workshop where we say, okay, what are the biggest assumptions that underpin the vision of what we have here? And so I think there's a temptation, especially in Gen AI world now, is to really focus on the technology. Will the technology be able to do that? Will the latest model, will Claude be better than Gemini, be better than OpenAI? When actually, I think we've learned this in digital, most of the challenges really come actually when the technology hits the humans and the organization and the operating systems within companies. And so taking a step back and figuring out what are the most important things that will make this successful, you can say, okay, well, there's some technical ones, sure. Like, how sure are we that those won't work or will work? And how important are they to the end vision? But also really think about the person using it, the customer, as well as how is this going to fit in the overall organization. Take the code generation tools, for example, which are very popular, probably one of the most successful deployments of Gen AI today. We know the technology works. All the Gen AI demos work really well, but it's quite easy to say, hey, does this work for the particular languages that we code in for our applications? You know, what's the latency and so on? So technically, there's not too many unknowns. But actually, how the developers and the engineers in the organization will use it, will they feel like their jobs are threatened by it? Those are actually far more important and are actually bigger assumptions to achieving that end vision of let's use this technology to make better products quicker that our customers love through generating code. So I think this approach allows you to really take a more holistic view of how is this project going to be successful. Whereas I think at the moment, and it's often been the sort of bête noire of a lot of AI projects, is let's focus on the technology, or do we have the data? And then months and months down the line, even if you can get those things to work, you don't realize customers or internal people don't want to use this in the way that we thought they did, and you're back to square one.
It's so true. And it's characteristic of AI. And in addition, any technology driven innovation for AI, it was blockchain or even drones or 3D printing, where everybody gets enamored with the technology and comes up with great proofs of concepts, but then it's hard to figure out how does that actually solve a problem for a human. And so that's what you're highlighting is let's focus on the human need first and then find out if we can solve it rather than saying, hey, it's technology first. And then you find out you've built something nobody wants.
Yeah, and I was just listening to a podcast which Ethan Mollick was on, and he's a professor at Wharton, very experienced educator, but also very early into AI. And he said, you know, in education, obviously, people have seen the demos from OpenAI, and it does look incredible to have this sort of AI tutor. But he said, look, I'm an expert in education. So yes, they can do this, but the role of a teacher is so much broader than just helping people to fix those problems. There's that interactivity. There's truly understanding where someone understands a subject. Because if you ask me, hey, do I understand this? Or any of the students, they're likely to say, yes, I do. And if you say, should we move on? Yeah. And so you move on and you haven't actually understood that. And there's tons of empirical research that shows that whilst it's very tempting to think, hey, AI can replace everything, these systems of the way that we work and the way that humans interact, the way we learn, are just so much more complex. And I think that's one of the dangers really is that if you just focus it from a technical point of view, then you don't really realize actually how do you embed this technology into the way that we work and we live. We're really at the very early stages, particularly with Gen AI, and it's all very exciting. But there's tons to be done to actually embed this into our processes and the way that we live and work.
So, as you think about a portfolio of use cases, so you've got an idea for 100 different ways that you can embed the technology to help a user or a customer. How do you think about the milestones or the KPIs that you would use in order to kind of evaluate progress through an innovation funnel, for example?
So I think when I've worked successfully in the past, we typically would split it up into this first aspect of customer discovery. So who's your customer? What problem do they truly have to solve? Then move into sort of validating the solution before then building a POC and ultimately scaling out. So sort of a 4-step funnel. And again, I think the danger with Gen AI is it's very tempting to just jump straight into building because it's so easy to build. You can just pull stuff off Hugging Face, and especially now with Meta releasing sort of Llama 3.1, which is very competitive with the OpenAI Anthropic models, the temptation is to go straight into building. And I did this myself actually in thinking about a sales virtual agent to help my sales teams, better qualify deals. When actually, again, the key thing is you can mock these things up. And that's what we did in the end, is that we actually had a human on the end actually asking the questions, because although sales managers and sales people will have a certain way of dialoguing, it's different when a salesperson is using a Gen AI sales manager. They ask different questions, they respond in different ways. And so it's super tempting to skip that first part of understanding of how does someone really want to use this, because it's just so easy now to go ahead and start building. Anyone can do that. And that's such a difference really from digital and mobile technologies that we started to use over the last decade, where at the point at which you start coding and building, there was a much greater cost. And roll back 20 years before the cloud, there was an even greater cost. So it's tempting now with this sort of low cost of entry to just go straight into the build process. And then you build a bit more. And if it doesn't work, okay, I better build a bit more. I think there's a temptation to skip this customer discovery phase, where you're really trying to understand what the problem is and how would you solve that problem before then moving to solution validation and then putting that in front of people. And there's plenty of sort of Wizard of Oz type techniques of actually simulating what you do before you've actually built it. And I think that it's kind of two aspects to that. Is one part is if you don't do that up front, then you could be wasting all of your time. But equally, as we were talking about before, and sort of figuring out what the key assumptions are behind achieving your vision, if you can identify, hey, what's the most important thing that I know least about the success of this? So, what Eric calls loafers, leap of faith assumptions. If you can identify the one or the two things that you think are so important to actually go out and test and experiment with, and you go, oh, these other 8 or 9, I think that's fine. They're important maybe, but I'm actually pretty certain that that'll work out. You can reduce the time to market and your effort by 80, 90%. And that's what then allows really rapid innovation. And that's so important right now because the technology moves on so quickly that before you know it, you might say, oh gosh, there's something else come out now, or there's this new capability which sort of renders the way that I was thinking about doing this differently. So that pace and that speed and not really wasting your time, the ultimate sort of definition of lean is, eliminating waste. So don't waste your time building things or testing things that you're fairly certain are true, and just go after those ones that are super important to what you want to achieve, but you're just not certain about. And I think, again, back to that code generation one, identifying how people would receive this, and then how would they need to change the way that they worked in order to take best advantage of the code generation tools, turned out to be way more important than did the tool itself work, or was tool A better than tool B?
Wow, lots of great insights there. So, Chris, you mentioned mocking things up, before you actually have a working model. What are some of the techniques that you've used in the past to maybe represent the model before you've built the whole thing to get that early customer or user feedback?
There's tons of ways of doing that, Ben, from really lo-fi ways where you just mock up actually the interaction, even on a piece of white paper, and say, is this the kind of thing that you were thinking about? Would you use it in this way? Through to, rather than having to build out intelligent AI in the background, just mocking up on a virtual agent. Because that is one of the ways that people interact with Gen AI today, is through chatbots. You just have a human in the background. See how people do that. And that's a very cheap way of figuring out, are they going to use it in the way that you want to? But I was actually speaking to an education startup the other day, and they created this this is for using AI in the classroom. Because teachers move around the classroom, they built this very sort of sophisticated, essentially like a microphone to pick up whatever the teacher was saying from wherever they were in the classroom. And it was very expensive. But they'd also given teachers a sort of handheld, almost like a mouse pointer. And they found that they used the mouse pointer the whole time. And that cost a real fraction of the cost of this sort of wonderful microphone, and they don't need the microphone anymore. And had they gone in and tested that in the classroom beforehand, they would have been able to figure this out, save themselves a ton of development time, but also a ton of cost. And because the cost is so much radically lower now, it also changes their target market and how they could actually think about rolling this out and do it much more quickly, changes their business model, how they think about, monetizing this technology. So it's just so important, I think, to go beyond what is the technology and can I get it to work in the way that I think it should be working, particularly as Gen AI is still very new, although it's everywhere in the press. Less than 5% of people have used it. So the people who are building these things are even smaller fraction, and they're obviously not teachers. They're not people who are in call centers. They're not people who are doing the jobs that could be augmented and improved by using this technology. So I think, especially when I work with clients or work internally inside big companies, the most important thing is to get those users on board and explain to them how we're going to work together on this. And you're not going to just say, go away and build this and I'll be back in 6 months. We're going to work with you very iteratively on this. And it's going to take some of your time. And it's important that you spend that time because that's what guarantees that projects are likely to be more successful. And we learn so much on the way because it's just a new paradigm for us all.
That's great. No, I appreciate the concrete example as well. So I guess as you're thinking then about the way that you're looking at a funnel of AI opportunities, we've talked a little bit about some of the milestones, maybe the work that's different and how the teams do the work to achieve those milestones. How do you think about governance? What's the role of senior leadership and how is that different from maybe a traditional leadership role?
It's always very important whenever you're innovating to bring your stakeholders with you. And I think helping them to understand the process that you're going through is really important. So that starts with the funnel. And when I was at BT, we were really quite specific about this, how long each stage would take, how many people we would commit at each stage. And therefore you could figure out how much resources was needed to do a given body of work to generate the ultimately successful ideas. We also articulated, look, it's a good process, but it's not magic. The majority of innovations are not successful. We know that empirically from startups, but also from corporate innovation. So we plan for that and we get people ready for that. I think the really important thing is that we make decisions based on real facts and data. So when I was talking earlier about sort of these leap of faith assumptions, it's okay. So if we got this assumption that we think is the most important one, what's the best way to test that? So scientific method, we'll have a hypothesis, and then we test that hypothesis with experiments. And then my teams who work on this, it's important to work together to design the right experiments. But then when the data comes back, it should be, if in a well-designed experiment, then allows you to really make a decision. Is this going to be successful or not? Sometimes you go, okay, this is the wrong experiment. We need to go back and do it. But the role of, therefore, senior management is understanding, like, what did we test? How do we know we should move forward or we should stop or we should pivot? And that's based on the evidence that you get from the experiments rather than people's opinions or someone's belief of how something should be used. So it's very empowering for those teams, but it's quite an adjustment, I think, for a lot of senior managers who tend to have an idea, and quite often they're the ones who are most passionate about the vision. But if you find that, hey, the customers are just not resonating the same way that you thought, you've got to bring that to life. But that can be a sort of challenging conversation. We used to run sort of governance boards around that, growth boards, we used to call them. And in that, the people running the experiments would explain what they'd done, the data that they'd found, and therefore what conclusion were they drawing from that. And that was a very empowering way for the teams to work because they felt truly in charge of their destiny. And a big cultural change that we needed to imbue with the teams was it's okay to say the data shows customers don't want this. Whereas I think going in, you always want to say, find, hey, 99% of customers didn't like this, but I did find one who loved it. Is that good? Probably not. Maybe you found a very specific segment that would make it work. But if you set up the experiment correctly beforehand, you'll say, look, from this experiment, I need to find that 20%, 50%, 80% of people say, yes, I would spend £10 a month on this. If you do the experiment, you find only one person says I would spend £10 and 99 people say they would spend nothing, then I think you've got your answer in a well-designed experiment, and then you stop. And the good thing is you can repurpose that resource. You can move on to the next idea, because for sure there aren't a shortage of ideas. They never have been, but particularly in a Gen AI world, there are tons of ideas. So it's actually really efficient to identify when things aren't going to work early and then repurpose that resource that you have, because resources are always constrained, onto the next best idea that we've got.
You'd mentioned allocating resources, which is oftentimes, especially in corporate AI development, corporate innovation, most of the spend is just in people's time. So how do you think about funding when it comes to a funnel of opportunities? You'd mentioned, for example, how many people do we assign to each stage of work? Could you maybe talk about how you've used metered funding in the past versus more traditional funding?
So you try and set out with that goal up front. So typically, particularly in corporate innovation, there is a target for the revenue run rate that you ultimately want to develop. So part of the way I worked in articulating this is we've got the funnel and we would expect this many opportunities to go through at each stage. So 50% kill rate in the first stage, then 50%, then 50%. See that, power of compounding, that means that if you put 16 ideas up front, only one's going to come out of the end and be that kind of blockbuster. And that's probably quite optimistic. So part of it is about helping people to understand if we have this sort of kill rate or stop rate where we're not going to continue with these, how many do we need to have if we want to hit our goals, and then resource accordingly. Equally, I think it's important actually to empirically actually work that through. So you don't need to start with a massive team to start with. If you've got no ideas and you're starting out from scratch, we used to just have one person work on a single idea working for 6 weeks. And often they would come back to the growth boards even quicker on that on customer discovery. So actually within a relatively small team in a relatively short period of time, you can get through a good number of ideas and people's visions for products, get through customer discoveries phase, then solution validation. And then at least in the systems I've designed in the past, it's really in that POC try to do as quickly as possible, but the time taken to do that is quite variable. It can be sort of 3 to 6 months. It just really depends on the context. In an industrial company, that might take a lot longer. Ford Motor Company or a Caterpillar. If you're building software, it can be a lot quicker. So once you got to that 3 to 6 months though, that's when we were actually really starting to commit in that final stage, which I call scale validation, real resources, because then you're trying to get revenue from customers. So that requires, legal contracts, requires go-to-market teams, potentially customer support and so on. That phase is really where a lot of the resources come in. But having that business model up front, even if it's not perfect, because you learn as you go along, helps to sort of set that foundation for how you move forward and how people understand what resources are needed. And I think when it comes to metered funding, the good news when you're talking to the CFO is, I don't need a huge chunk of change up front. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run my process through my funnel. And at each point, I'm going to come back with evidence saying whether we should continue or not continue with this. If we're going to continue, I'll explain why. And I've got data to back that up. And I can tell you how much the next phase is going to cost. So I only need the money when I make progress. And that progress is based on real customers saying, yes, they want this, or no, they don't want it. Or if one of your biggest loafers, your leap of faith assumptions is a technical one, I'll come back and ask for more funding when I've been able to prove technically that we can actually go ahead and do this. So it's a very different model to saying, look, I just need this big team up front. And that temptates. So imagine you say, right, I'm going to plan for my scale validation. So I need salespeople, I need engineers, I need customer service. But if I've got no ideas right now, what are these people going to do? They're just going to sit there and not do a great deal, or you're just going to leap straight to the solution, build something out, try and sell it without going through those phases up front. So metered funding, I think, is a really smart way of getting what are often quite skeptical sort of finance folks in particular on board for this is a responsible way of doing innovation where we only ask for more resources when we've got the evidence to back it up that we think this idea is going to be successful. And that confidence builds as you go through the funnel. At the end of customer discovery, probably if you're going to move forward, you've found a customer segment that resonates with the problem. But it still doesn't mean that you're guaranteed success. The next part is, can you create a solution or mock up a solution for them that they then say, yeah, they would spend money on? But meter funding is so much better way of doing that because it does also force the teams to not skip steps and jump to conclusions. So I found that to be a very powerful way of moving forward. And I hate waste. I was a manufacturing engineer, so Toyota production system was a big thing that I learned at university. And so a lean innovation system, applying that particularly right now to Gen AI is super important. And there's good examples out there already, right? In the market, that Humane pin and that Rabbit R1. And you got to question how much sort of customer discovery and solution validation did they do? Because I think you could have just put the pin or the Rabbit R1 thing there and said, without any technology behind it, and seen if people would really want to use it in the way that they envisaged. And I think you probably would have got the results saying, maybe not. But actually the teams went out and they built the whole thing and they had the manufacturing set up and so on. They've potentially wasted a lot of resources and time, but that's the way it goes sometimes.
And that's the reason we're doing this podcast, is trying to share with people lean practices so they don't waste a bunch of time and money to find out that they've built something customers don't want or users don't want. You'd mentioned, Chris, the kind of the cut rates, right? And so maybe some of our listeners might be astonished by some of those cut rates in the funnel. Could you just repeat those for the listeners?
So let's use real numbers. So let's say that we had 16 ideas that we put into the top of the funnel in customer discovery. We would plan for only 8 of those progressing on, so a 50% cut rate. Now, that both be because we know that if you're working quickly and you're doing 6 weeks customer discovery, we could afford that kind of kill rate. The other thing is, though, if your resources are constrained, let's just say you really luck out and there are all of those 16 that you put through, customers want. Then you can make some choices and go, okay, so which are my best 8? And I'm going to focus the resources on those because then you can accelerate those. So it's not necessarily saying that, hey, out of 16, 15 are flops. It's saying some of them will be flops. I can guarantee that. But actually, it's prioritizing and focusing your next stage of funding because there's more people required to do the next stage of the funnel, the solution validation. So let's focus on those 8. So then we've got 8 ideas in the solution validation stage, right? We run that for another 6 weeks. And then at the end of that, we plan for another kill rate of 50%. So we're down to 4. And again, same idea. Maybe they're all great, all the customers are resonating with them, but which are the best 4? Which are the ones that are going to generate the most returns for us? Then in the POC phase, we go down from 4 to 2, and then ultimately the one that we really invest in to go to that scale validation phase, which is a lot more resources required. So that was just something that we modeled at the last firm that I was at and worked for us, because obviously it takes a little bit of time to build out a portfolio of ideas. If you end up with 16 ideas and 12 are actually world beaters, well, firstly, good luck to you. Well done. You've done brilliantly. But that's a good basis to actually go and secure more funding. But otherwise, for us, it was just a good way of retaining discipline. And the other thing is it gave permission for the team to come back and say, look, customers don't want this. That cultural change was really important, that they felt they were led by the facts and it wasn't a reflection on their work and how well they'd run customer discovery to come back and say, no, we shouldn't carry on. But I think that focus of resources on the real winners is really important as well in terms of then speeding up and getting products to market quickly.
Fascinatingly, you just mentioned cultural change among the teams. So the definition of what good looks like is different for the teams. What are some of the other resistance to this way of working that you've encountered, and how have you helped overcome that?
I think the biggest one was from the teams where, particularly in a corporate environment, got an idea, especially if it's sponsored by someone very senior or market research, that's expensive market research has been done. People will then, okay, we're going to follow the process. We'll do customer discovery. And they're always looking for reasons to say, hey, yeah, customers really do want this. because that's kind of the way it is in corporate life. Everything needs to be a success. There is no failure. So particularly at the start, the team would set up good experiments because that was a group exercise, identify the most important assumptions and then what are the right experiments. When they came back with the data, it's okay, present the data. And then I would sit there and I would agree the resources for the next stage. And then the data would be indicating, saying some examples, hey, customers don't really want this. We've not really hit the benchmarks we expected when we set up these experiments or the success criteria. And then they say, yeah, and I think we should continue. Wait a minute, the data's just said that threshold of customers saying they would pay for this is not there. And they say, oh yeah, but then we found this data. And actually, I think, towards the end of the test, we found more people who were really more positive about this. Maybe it's the way that we're doing it at the start. So it's just that sort of cultural part of, if I'm working on something, then it should be a success. So the biggest change was people feeling confident enough to come back and say, I stand by my work. I've run great tests. I've run them in the right way. And I believe in the data. And the data says we should not continue at this. That is my recommendation. What can I go work on next? And that took a little bit of time, getting the right synthesis of the decision based on the data. But that was the biggest cultural change. Then, as we've already talked about on the podcast, is helping, particularly finance, because finance have, over the years, had probably some mixed interactions with innovation teams. And there's always an ebb and flow of innovation cycles, depending on the economic cycle, helping them to really understand that we really did have a process and that we had a business model behind this, the whole aspect of metered funding. So it all takes time. And that really was my role in leading these teams, was that stakeholder management. So encouraging both the teams, but also managing upwards and to the people who ultimately commission the resources to make sure that they understood what we were doing and felt involved in the process. And honestly, it sounds quite simple now. And in many respects, it is simple. But my experience is, CEOs, CFOs, they just love this. When you can explain to them how you're working, they'll question, a bit like you did there, is really 50% kill rate? That's terrible. What are you doing? It's like you're wasting 50% of my resources up front. So there's a little bit of an explanation to be done. But ultimately, there are often, again, we're talking largely about large corporate environments here, but in large corporates, you don't have to look too far to have found examples of where people have spent millions, tens of millions, sometimes even hundreds of millions on innovations that have failed. And you can say, well, look, if you want, let's just go back and look at that. Hindsight's 2020, but here's the reasons why this failed. Could we have designed an experiment up front much earlier in the process, before we committed all of this cost, to actually figure out whether, this particular assumption was true? And in 99% of the cases, that is the case. Got to duck and dive a bit and understand, the audience that you've got. But there are usually plenty of examples of failure that you can point to because a good system wasn't run and the right experiments weren't run at the right time.
Chris, this has been amazing. Unfortunately, we're just running out of time. And so I would say last question from my side would be, based on everything you've learned in this space over the last 10 plus years in working in AI, what are the top insights you've gleaned from your journey that you can share with your fellow corporate AI executives?
So I'll offer you three, and hopefully we talked a bit about these as we've gone through. So I think number one is just don't get blindsided and obsessed with the tech. Is technology lives in a human and an organizational system. And the tech's in many respects raced ahead. But for Gen AI in particular, is the biggest sources of failure and where products won't succeed and where you'll get failures are when it starts to interact with real users that you're expecting to use this and the organizational systems and constructs within which the technology will be utilized. Focus on that part. Don't just build out the tech, because I really believe in many respects that's not the hardest thing here. Second thing is, if you adopt this approach of, once you've got a vision for what you want your product to do, is then identify what are the assumptions, what are the key assumptions behind this, and then map those on the two axes. How important are they to the success? And then how certain are we? And then test the ones in the first instance that are really important, but you're not certain about, because that then provides that focus of effort for your teams to then say, okay, we think that a Gen AI customer service agent is going to be loved by our customers because it'll give them much quicker answers to all the questions that they've got. Go find out, figure out what the most important things to the division that you've got, and then go test those first. And then that last piece is, we've been talking a bit about metered funding and the sort of business model for innovation. So inherent in that is a plan for projects not moving forward. I'm not sure whether failure is the right word, because it's a conscious decision to not move forward and repurpose your resources and focus them on higher value adding activities. But explain to your stakeholders of, how does this process work? Why won't we continue with every particular idea? And explaining to them that allows you to test many more ideas. Everyone understands that, you've got to try quite a few different things before you find the one that really works. So having a business model for innovation and innovating new ideas in Gen AI is very important, because as we talked about, it's so easy to build the technology and build out great demos. So those, I think, would be my 3 top pieces of advice.
Those are amazing. Thank you so much. And Chris, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Pleasure. Thanks, Ben.
The Lean AI podcast is brought to you by Lean Startup Co. To find out more about our Lean AI approach to generating more AI wins with far less wasted time and investment, including our training workshops, pilot programs, and full implementation offerings, visit us at www.leanstartup.co. Search the Lean AI podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Lean Startup Co., thanks for listening and sharing with your colleagues and friends if you found this episode insightful.